Okay, welcome to this interview with the wonderful Liz Pemberton. Liz Pemberton has been somebody that has been on my radar for a very, very long time. I've been admiring from afar the work that she has done on anti-racism in the early years. She is known as the Black Nursery Manager, but I'm not going to spend too much time speaking about her and for her. I'm going to ask you, Liz, welcome, and who are you? Okay. How have you got here?
How have I got here? Thank you, Benny. And equally, I have also been a long-term admirer of your work and also the way in which you shake tables, intentionally shake tables. So your work around diversity and inclusion, your work around equity has really been something that I have just had a deep admiration for. So thank you. I just wanted to let you know that before we got into how did I get here, who I am,
Yeah.
and why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I have a training and consultancy company called the Black Nursery Manager, and I started that in 2020,
Mhm.
having spent about 16 years being a nursery manager. So working primarily with children aged 0 to 5 in Birmingham, if you can't already tell by my beautiful Brummy twangs, and thinking really about what it meant to think about strategies to do with anti-racist practice in an ever-evolving and changing UK, and very locally, I guess, in Birmingham, the city that I was born in, the city that I live in, the city that I'm very passionate about. What does it mean in a landscape that, again, has seen lots of shifts and lots of changes with regards to communities that live there and
Mm.
how long those communities have existed there? Thinking about what it meant for those children of the variety of families that we have, what it meant to have a early years provision that catered for the cultural needs
Mm.
of those children. When we're thinking about that, in the nursery that I managed, is part of our family business. So my mom started in her own early years journey owning children's day nurseries in the late 80s
Wow.
in Birmingham. So my mom, still to this day, absolute veteran, big up Yvonne Kerr, is in one of the nurseries that she has, the original nursery that she owns, called the Playhouse. And
Mm.
that is in an area that some of you may be familiar with, called Smethwick.
Mhm.
And the history of race relations, particularly in Smethwick, we can trace back very, 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 very long time ago, I guess. But thinking about, that Rivers of Blood speech by Enoch
Yeah,
Powell,
yeah.
thinking about what that meant on a national stage, what that did to people and communities in Smethwick, and knowing about that history is absolutely essential. So it may seem like I'm going off on a tangent, but context is everything, and history is
Yeah,
very
yeah.
important when we have these conversations. My mom opened that business in the late 80s as a Black woman who was born in Jamaica, came over to the UK at 14 years old, and really set out her stall. Her father, my grandfather, already was here and
Mm.
came to the UK in 1954 to join his
Wow.
brother, who was in the RAF.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Really important, again, history and context, because being born in Jamaica wasn't something that was seen as out of the ordinary. You were seen as a British citizen at
Mm,
that
mm,
time, Jamaica being one of the colonies of Britain, and thinking about what that meant for somebody like my dad transition from Jamaica to the UK, initially London and then settled eventually in Coventry, and what that meant for him to send for his only daughter, my mother, to come over here, when she was 14, and what that then means for me, being my
mm,
mother's
mm,
daughter. And when we talk about the work of anti-racism, we have to talk about the work and the power of legacy, the
mm,
importance of
mm.
that, and the historical context in everything that we do, because nothing happens in a vacuum.
Right.
So, in case people think I just popped up in 2020 and started this Instagram platform called the Black Nursery Manager, people need to get to know and understand this has come out of a long history
Mm,
of
mm,
doing this work, and doing this work with intention,
mm,
doing
mm.
this work knowing that actually the real life consequences of making sure that an early years provision, which is culturally sensitive, an early years
Yeah.
provision that is actively doing anti racist work, an early years provision that is really thinking about how they tailor what is happening for the children in that space. And not just children of the global majority either,
Mm, mm,
children who are racialized as white, children who are coming from a range of different class backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, children that live in different spaces and places and home lives and family setups.
mm,
The word, intersectionality, coined, of course, by, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. We
mm.
have to talk about the intersections of identity, and we have to think about what that means for me as I'm introducing myself,
Yeah,
you as I was speaking, why your work was important to me, my mother, my grandfather, but also as well, when I became a nursery manager in 2004, why I have to lay out that history is because you've got to know this has always been in my blood.
yeah,
My
yeah.
mum having the business is something that has been really instrumental in how I've seen the provision of
Mm,
early
mm.
years education through the 80s and the 90s and 2000s. I have seen an evolving and changing landscape politically,
Yeah, yeah.
socially, economically, and thinking about what that's meant for me. It's helped me to shape what kind of early years provision I wanted to provide. So I
Mm,
managed the second of my mum's day nurseries and managed it in an area in Birmingham called Edgbaston.
mm,
Again,
mm.
some of the people who are watching, listening may be familiar with Birmingham, may be familiar with Edgbaston. And that I often say there are two Edgbastons, that there is Edgbaston and there is Edgbaston. And I say that again for people to understand there are implications around socioeconomics, there are
Mm,
implications
mm,
around class from me just saying Edgbaston or Edgbaston. Where my nursery was located was very much Edgbaston.
mm.
We were bordering an area called Ladywood. And I think, again, when we're thinking about socioeconomics, we're thinking about geography, we're thinking about children and families, what that meant to be in the perhaps in some ways the leafy suburbs of
Mm.
Edgbaston, but also not too far from, the other part of Edgbaston and Ladywood,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
also what it meant to be a black nursery manager
Mm,
in
mm.
that nursery at that time. So we're talking about, I said, the early 2000s,
Yeah.
and also a black nursery manager who was building upon the legacy of her own mother's business.
Mm, mm.
And so, because colloquially and locally, we were known as the Black Nursery. People were just like, oh, yeah, yeah, the Black Nursery. Because there were loads of nurseries in Edgbaston. And people were like, oh, which nursery? Yeah, yeah, the Black Nursery. Oh, Liz is there. Yeah, 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 I know Liz. Because being a part of a community
Mm.
is something that has been very integral to the work that I've been doing.
Yeah.
I am not removed from the community. I am a part of the community and I
Mm.
do not hide that. Of course, I don't. It's really clear for people to see that
Yeah.
there are lots of different ways in which I can tap in and tap out of different elements of community. So, yes, I'm racialized as Black. I'm Black. I'm
Mm.
here. I use the pronouns she and her. I identify as a gender woman. I
Mhm.
am a Black woman born in the very early 80s,
Mm,
coming
mm.
into a space which means that I am thinking about the way in which my lived experiences have been shaped by my racialized identity, have been
Yeah,
shaped
yeah.
by having parents who were born in Jamaica and came to the UK,
Yeah,
have
yeah.
been shaped by my own socioeconomic background, have been shaped by my own experience of schooling. And also, my professional life has been shaped by the way in which I've thought very carefully about crafting an early years provision
Mm.
which speaks to not ignoring those things about children and families' identities.
And this is where
Yeah.
I was going to ask about,
Mhm.
why specifically anti-racism? Because, we talked about everybody's identity being important, but you've honed in, and really focusing on anti-racist practice. So why anti-racism, and why in particular EYFS?
I think one of the things around the early years is that we often hear about those years being the most important of anyone's life, that those
Mm,
things that
mm.
happen to us in those years between naught and three, naught and five,
Yeah.
naught and seven, it's very, very instrumental in terms of who we are going to be, those early childhood
Mm,
experiences.
mm.
So we hear a lot about adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. We
Yeah.
hear a lot about early years and early childhood traumas. We hear a lot about those experiences that we've had that we can't quite put our finger on, but we know something happened at nursery. We know something happened like when we were really young. We might have photographs that hark back to those days. We
Mm.
hear stories and narratives about our early years from our main caregivers, whether that be our parents, whether that be our grandparents, whether that
Yeah.
be family friends, whoever. But the need to focus on anti racism, I think, has been born out of knowing that, as well as all of the things that we experience in our
Mm.
early childhood, being really positive or really negative or just, in between.
mm,
One of those things that can shape our experiences adversely, if we are of the global majority,
mm,
if we are black or brown, is racism. One of
mm,
those
mm,
things that can really impact how we see the world and how we are processed through the world in a racist society is
mm.
racism.
Yeah, yeah.
And so when I'm thinking about the need to talk about anti racism, to be active in pushing back against racism, I think the need for me to do that was born out of observing,
Mm,
living, and understanding that we do not exist in a vacuum,
yeah,
that there
yeah.
are lots of things that are we're subject to and we have no control over it. So
Mm,
we,
mm,
we think about abuse and we talk about abuse very openly in the early years. We think about ways that we can counter abuse. We are trained within our roles as early years educators. We are trained in safeguarding. We are trained to look out for the signs of physical
mm,
abuse, for the signs of sexual abuse, neglect.
mm,
We are trained to do that. We are trained to make sure that the environment that we're providing for the children is safe. Health and safety training is a big thing. First aid, we have to make sure that we are reviewing that every 3 years or so. Pediatric first aid is absolutely essential. We aren't trained actually to look at the impact necessarily of trauma and specifically the impact of racial trauma.
yeah.
And how can we not do that if we accept and understand? We know that we live in a racist society. It might not be spoken about if you are perhaps not impacted by racism, but
Mm,
certainly those of us who have been, whether knowingly or unknowingly, those of us who are of the global majority will
mm,
remember our first incident of being processed through a lens of race.
yeah.
We will remember the first time we were told, whether it was negatively or whether it was positively, that we were black or that
Mm,
we were brown or that we weren't white.
yeah,
We
yeah.
will have a memory of that. And more often than not, in the work that I've done, I have found that that memory has been linked to something traumatic.
Mm, mm,
And
yeah.
that has happened in an environment like a school or a
Mm,
nursery. Our first experience of that, perhaps in the family setting, hadn't been traumatic, but
yeah,
our
yeah.
experience of that within a system, the
Mm,
education system, of which the early years is a part of,
mm,
has, as I said, in my experience and the work that I've done, more often than not, it has been linked
mm.
to something that hasn't been positive.
That's really, really interesting. The distinction between what happens in terms of your racial identity at home and what happens in terms of your racial identity in a kind of more white spaces. We think about kind of the system and the structures that are out there and how your racial identity can be formed in very different ways and in some ways be quite contrasting,
Mm-hmm.
those two experiences. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. So thank you for sharing that with me. I'm conscious that people don't necessarily know what anti-racism actually is. That term has really come to the fore in the last 3 or 4 years, I would say, even though it's been a long conversation
Yeah,
over time. But in the
yeah.
last 3 or 4 years, people have been hearing it
Mm.
and hearing quotes about it. For
Yeah.
you, what does it mean? What does it mean in theory? What does it mean in practice?
So, in theory, if we look at anti racism as a term, thinking about, I guess, consistent, conscious, intentional choices to push back against racism.
Mm, mm,
I say that, but then I assume people understand what racism is. So we have to define racism because when we are having, again, a national dialogue at the moment around what racism is and what racism isn't,
mm,
the people who are tending to have these conversations are not equipped because, number one, they haven't been on the receiving end of racism. And number
mhm,
two, it's open up for discussion. Usually, the talking heads that we are seeing in a national debate are people who are not of the global majority, people who are
mm,
racialized as white. And I always say it's akin to thinking about sexism and having men just define what sexism is
yeah.
and telling us if we are on the receiving end of the negative um, impact of sexism. And I'm thinking about what racism is. Yes, we think about the prejudice plus social and institutional power and what that does to marginalize people of the
Mm, mm,
global majority. But again, this is why racial literacy is important. What is social power? What is institutional power? And who has that? And why does it happen to be people who are racialized as white?
mm, mm,
And again, we have to think about history
mm,
and what race is as a social construct. That actually, the idea of race is not real, it's man made. And we have to be really clear about understanding that. That yes, we have come to accept that race is just the lens or a way that we
mm,
start to process people or see people, because racism is very real. So let's not get that twisted. The
mm,
impact of racism and racism is very real, but race is a social construct. It is man made.
mm,
And we
mm,
have to understand the reasons why it was created. And it was created to categorize people. And so when we start understanding the origins and the history of why race was created and why it was created in such a way that would place people who were racialized as white at the top, white Europeans specifically, and people who were black Africans specifically at the bottom,
mm.
we then can start to have a nuanced conversation, a conversation which is informed with facts about why racism exists. That it's more than calling somebody the N word. It's
Yeah.
more than calling somebody the P word. Racism is about power, and
Mm,
who has power in a society that is built based on
mm,
creating races.
mm,
If
mm,
we think me and you here on this
mhm.
screen, we identify through perhaps a different range of identifiers, but
Yeah.
one of the things that people might think or see and use to define is that, oh, yeah, like Benny, yeah, she's Indian. They might just use that word and not understand. Some people might say, oh, yeah, Benny, yeah, she's brown. Oh, Benny, I think she's South Asian. Now all of those have, they might be correct, they may be
Mhm.
incorrect. They might be words or phrases that you don't choose to use.
Mm, mm,
People will look at me and be like, "Oh yeah, it's a black woman,"
mm.
you know. But what does that actually mean? Now, when we are thinking about how and why we need to understand the history of the creation of race,
Mm.
we have to do it because we have to get to grips with understanding racial literacy. We
Yeah,
need to
yeah.
know what it is that we're talking about, and we cannot dismantle something that we are not able to understand and name.
This is the
So we have
hugely
to,
important
yes,
thing, isn't it? It's
hugely
this
important,
racial
hugely
literacy.
important.
The more you're talking about it, the more I'm kind of thinking about my own journey about, how
Mm,
much I learned around categorization. And I don't think that if you don't have a working knowledge, like you said, if you don't have a working knowledge of that, how do you counter it?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah.
when we're talking about EYFS spaces, it's not built in to a
Nope,
curriculum there.
nope.
And, there's this impact of racism can be felt very, very early, as you've said.
Definitely, definitely. And
So,
it's very subtle. It's in the
yeah,
very implicit. It
yeah,
is in the
yeah,
very building of a curriculum or building of a way in which we do things in the early years
yeah,
foundation
yeah.
stage, which is taken as normal. It's just taken as the
Mm,
given. And I want to question and probe the normal.
yeah,
I want to
yeah.
question and probe what it is that we're doing and dispel this myth around what people assume anti racism is in the early years foundation stage or what anti
Mm,
racism is in the early years sector. Because
yeah,
we're thinking about not just interpersonal, we're thinking about structural and systemic as well. So, of course, it's great to have an anti-racist policy for your
yeah,
nursery.
yeah,
That's fantastic. Yet interpersonal instances of racism. But if we dig deeper, we have to think about those structural and systemic things, the
yeah,
normalizing of only studying theorists who are white and European,
yeah,
that we
yeah,
just accept that Montessori and Piaget and Balby are, three of the theorists that we would look at if we are
mm,
training to be an early years educator.
yeah.
Why?
Yeah, and
So
this
that's
is the
the
thing,
question.
isn't it? Around anti-racist practice for staff. You talked a little bit about can't just be policy. It's recognizing that it is baked into the system.
Yes.
So what does what does good movement towards anti-racism look like? Where do people look? How do they find this information?
I think, first of all, as I said, it's the questioning, the why, the
Mm-mm.
recognition. So when we talk about training to be an early years educator, we are asked to be reflective practitioners.
Yeah.
Reflection and keeping a reflective diary is something that we are trained to do as early years educators. And I would ask that if we are thinking about anti racism, perhaps if we were thinking about it as a module in
Mm,
our early years education journey, the probing of the questioning and the asking why. Why do we do that?
mm,
Why do we do it like that? Why are we studying these particular theorists?
yeah,
Why is it that we have to look at our resources? Why is it that we have to have these conversations out loud?
mm,
Why is it that we have to advertise them, not those things? What is it that we're auditing and why are we auditing? How do we move past tick box? How do
mm,
we move past saying, okay, well, we've got some black dollars, so that's enough? Why isn't that enough? And so when we think about, as I said, conversations and questions around perhaps representation, representation is great to an extent,
mm.
but what happens when we lift off the lid?
Yeah,
Okay, because
yeah,
there is more than the need to have books who have got main
mm, mm,
protagonists who are black or main protagonists who are South Asian. What happens to our Gypsy Roman traveller communities who are
yeah,
also
yeah,
marginalised? What happens to the intersecting things around identity to do with, say, our LGBTQ families
mm,
and um, having a racialized identity that isn't white? You know, what does it mean to have literature that represents that and is just normalized, that it
mm.
isn't specially taken out for LGBTQ month or Black History Month
Yeah,
or
yeah,
Diwali or, Lunar New Year? What does it
mm,
mean to have these things just baked in
mm,
and normalized in the
mm.
same way that we would look at, you know, an activity that we might do, which is like Play-Doh?
Yeah,
What does it
yeah,
mean
yeah,
to have paint that, yeah, of course we've got a brown paint there. And of course we've got this coloured paint here and that coloured paint, that's normal because we accept that there may be children here who have many different skin tones,
mm.
even if the setting is predominantly white, even if the setting is all white.
Mm-mm. Now that's a really interesting point because these are really quite tangible things. There's one thing to have
Yeah.
representation in books, like you've said, as long as we're thinking about the intersectionality and the
Mm-hmm.
and that's not all, is it? It's a
Mm-hmm.
recognition that the skin color crayons in the crayon packs quite
Yeah.
often are really quite limited. So
Yeah.
what does it look like for students then? Do you have tangible examples of the kinds of things that staff need to be able to recognize and do for young
Mm.
people? What's the experience of young people of anti-racist practice?
It's been really interesting for me, Benny, on this journey, being a facilitator, a trainer, an educator, somebody who is holding space to have the conversation. First of all, that has been a big relief to many teams of early years
Mm,
educators and early years managers, having space to have a conversation, which is really open, really frank, really honest, that doesn't hide in fear. The first step is actually bringing this out into the open because you'll
mm,
be surprised maybe at how many times people have wanted to ask questions,
yeah,
but the fear of getting it wrong or not asking it correctly or using the wrong words has stopped the conversation from happening.
yeah,
So it means that everything is couched in fear, therefore everything is couched in the forbidden. And because the national dialogue around race and racism is so skewed
mm,
and so poorly managed, and that's intentional as well, that's deliberate, it means people don't even think they can say the word black. For
yeah,
me,
yeah,
for instance, naming my organization the Black Nursery Manager, it forces people who have never said black, just say black. If you are talking about somebody's racialized identity and you're having a conversation as a student, as somebody who is training to work with children, you need to be able to understand that these are words that you can say out loud, that
yeah, yeah,
actually we have to move past the understanding that no, you don't say colored in
mm,
2024.
mm,
You
mm,
can say black.
yeah,
But because people don't have the conversation out
no,
loud, they are just going by what they have been told, perhaps in their family units,
yeah,
or in the area that they live in, or in the place that they've grown up in, and they've been told. Particularly in my experience, if they're racialized as white, that it's more polite to say coloured.
yeah, yeah. I've definitely had that, and I've seen the consequences of children not being taught that certain racial descriptors are acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
That it leads to a lot of confusion. I had a South Asian student. I think he was year 8 at the time, and somebody called him the N word, and I thought that was really interesting. And he said, "What am I?"
Mm-hmm.
And there were so many students who just didn't have a sense of their racial identity,
Yeah.
but also would apologize when they were giving me descriptions of each other and say, I'm sorry, I know it sounds racist, but I'm going to have to say that, he was black. And I said, I would often say, was he black? Yes, he
Mm-hmm.
was. Okay, so you can say black then.
There you go. There you
I
go.
know,
And that's what I
but
mean.
they're not
How,
being taught that.
yeah. That's really indicative of how how poorly this society is set up to talk
Mm,
about race. And if we are teaching children during their earliest years how to perhaps eat food, what is this item called in the house? What's this part of your body? We're teaching children this is an elbow, this is your nose.
mm.
If we are teaching children to talk about the texture of their hair, we should teach them to say your hair is coily and
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
curly and it feels really soft and it's
Mm,
beautiful. And your hair is straight or your hair is wavy and your hair is blonde or your hair is
yeah,
black. We're teaching children everything except for, oh, and the color of his skin. Oh, no, we can't talk about that. Why? Children are going to ask. We
yeah,
know
yeah,
children are inquisitive, and we know as well children like to identify at a very early age. And
yeah.
thinking about that, what are we doing if we are limiting that then to say,
Mm,
oh,
mm,
but we can't say that? We can talk about everything else. We can talk about how your friend has got a yellow coat
mm.
and your jumper has got polka dots and
Yeah.
your scarf has got lovely rainbow colours, but we can't say that your skin is brown.
Mm, mm.
That's bizarre, and it sets up actually a space for confusion.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I understand the reasons why. I get it. That fear
Mhm.
is built in.
Totally.
What are we allowed to say? What are we not allowed to say? What will I be accused of if I
Mm-hmm.
start describing people's race?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I addressed it with my children with books, and I
Mm-hmm.
would often point out the characteristics or colors of the skin of the characters and
Mm-hmm.
texture of hair, thinking perhaps this might not happen at school. I'm not sure if anybody will have this conversation. And we'll often talk about my skin as being brown and my partner's skin being
Mm-hmm.
white, and just that difference. But I do think that there's two really important things there. Things around art and drawing and being able to be accurate with that. Things around describing race. Is there anything else that you think is a really important part of anti-racist practice in
Mm-hmm.
EYFS?
I think when we're thinking
Specifically.
about some of the things, I think structurally, there are lots of places where we go to get information. And
Mm,
often in the early years, there are an array of conferences.
mm,
There are people positioned as early years experts. I would
mm,
ask people to question who are the experts? What do they look like? And who do they represent? Where are these conversations taking place?
mm,
And who is the audience? So if we look at the early years workforce, we know that people from a range of different ethnicities, a
mm,
range of different racialized identities inhabit that. We know. We
mm.
also accept that if we're talking about the UK, we live in a space where there are pockets of the UK where it's predominantly white, if not
Mm,
all white. We also accept as well that when we are thinking to look at early years experts, and if we're thinking about some of those systemic changes, we should not be afraid to call out lack of representation because it's
mm,
important, but to call it out in a way which helps people to identify this might be something you've not understood or not acknowledged or not realized or recognized because it's almost like confirmation bias. Everybody
yeah,
on that
yeah,
panel looks like you've
yeah.
organized it, or this organization hasn't thought it's important. In the same way, they would perhaps look and think they would never dream of having a panel of all men.
Mm, mm,
If we're thinking about an early years conference specifically, we're thinking about educators specifically, we would feel really comfortable, I would argue, to say, well, no, hold on, there's no women on this panel. There are
yeah.
no people, we're not at a space where I'd say we're able to actually say, well, what about our non-binary
Mm,
people?
mm,
What's happening here? We need to get more comfortable with the language of inclusion,
yeah,
but that
yeah.
means being able to identify, hmm, this isn't sitting right with me. I know this is not going to speak to my particular staff team, but have I got the boldness that it takes to call it out? Because it's often met with a sense of fragility,
Yeah, yeah.
a sense of how dare you tell me that I'm not doing this correctly, instead of, you know what, thank you for pointing that out. I
Mm,
hadn't thought
mm,
of that. If I'm
yeah.
thinking about the way in which I speak, if I use ableist language, I want somebody to tell me, you know what, Liz, what you just said was ableist. And
Mm,
I think
mm,
you need to rethink about how you phrase that. I start talking about, for instance, color blindness, because I recognize that perhaps that's ableist language
yeah,
if I'm
yeah.
talking about color blindness. What do I do to reframe, to reshape, to not use, to think actually more critically about the way in which I'm describing?
Yeah.
So, systemically, I think we need to get rid of all white panels, and people who are creating and developing early years experts and early years conferences need
Mm,
to look at that critically. And
mm.
if they are being called out about it, that their response needs to be, you know what, thank you.
Yeah,
Didn't even
yeah.
think about it
Didn't even
instead of
think
how
about it.
dare. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Instead of how
And
dare.
it's interesting as you were talking, I was considering, the impact that all white staff can have on early years settings. Um, and recruitment is difficult. And, we know the challenges that are faced by all sectors in this, by all of the education phases in all of this. Um, but when it reminded me of when you said pediatric first aid is really important. And yet, we've had a huge shift in understanding of what certain illnesses look like on black skin or
Yeah,
brown skin.
yeah.
Um, and if you are not familiar with the permutations of
Mm-hmm.
illnesses in very young children, um, and what it looks like on different skin types, maybe because you've never experienced or you've never studied it, that's going to be a problem in the early years setting, surely.
Definitely. So we see there the interruption of medical racism. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
medical racism has to be disturbed. It has to be
Mm,
interrupted. It has
mm,
to be dismantled because it impacts the work that we do as early years professionals.
mm.
If, as you said, we have got first aid training and we're never taught to think about what chickenpox looks like on darker skin,
Yeah,
what measles looks like, what it looks like to have a bruise if you do not have pale skin,
yeah, yeah,
we're going to be doing some children a disservice because to not know that actually is to not be fully equipped to do your job.
yeah,
But it's
yeah,
often the case that people haven't ever thought about that. So it means that we are now in a space we are celebrating, the first illustrations of
mm, mm.
black and brown skin. That's really embarrassing. I think
Yeah,
that's really sad. I
yeah,
think it's really pathetic. But I also recognize as well, this is uh, demonstrating how much work we have to do
yeah, yeah,
because we do not
absolutely.
talk about race, we do not talk about racism. We have been stagnated in our conversation. As I said, it stops that. Calling
Mm.
somebody the N word, calling somebody the P word. That's
Yeah,
racism.
yeah,
The
yeah.
end.
And this is where I was going to ask this question later, but I think I'm going to bring
Mm-hmm.
it forward because I'm interested simply because I'm anticipating some people saying, well, when do we talk to children about racism? Is
Mm-hmm.
it too early to talk about racism? Yes, we tell them to be nice to each other, to be kind to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we need to bring in race at this stage? Surely they're too young. That's a provocation, not my actual belief in
Yeah,
it.
of course. And I would say, what is the age that children shouldn't experience racism?
Mm,
You know, there is no age actually that a black or a brown child is going to encounter racism, and it can be very, very early. It can
yeah.
be in the baby room. It can be the one black child that's always crying and doesn't get picked up. It
Mm,
is the one black child that is not seen as cute as the
mm,
child who has lighter skin because they just don't meet the beauty ideals. And it's really sad to say, but it's the reality, isn't it? For
yeah,
some
yeah.
people, for some children, and for some conversations that we couch as too complex or too mature, the reason that we have organizations, charities that deal with sexual abuse for children is because it's a horrible subject,
Mm,
it's a
mm,
horrible topic. We don't want to ever think about children under the age of 5 being sexually abused, but it happens.
mm.
And there is a need for that conversation to be couched in, the NSPCC had this campaign, which was like the pants campaign, and what's in my
Yeah.
pants stays in my pants. And the character was, it was like a cartoony character, but it was something that local authority nationally recognized. We need to have these conversations in the preschool room.
Mm,
We
mm.
need to have these conversations in the toddler room. We need to say to children, what's in your pants stays in your pants. And actually, that filtered through onto the shop floor, if you like. So in the
Yeah, yeah.
nursery, we would be like, what's in your pants stays in your pants. And nobody is supposed to look in your knickers.
Mm,
Having conversations like that, maybe there could have been a time where people are, oh no, we don't want to talk to children about abuse. We're not saying to children, you will be sexually abused. What we are saying to children is it's age and stage appropriate.
mm.
What's in your pants stays in your pants.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
message, as children mature, it takes on a different meaning. But we
Mm-mm.
started to plant the seed from very early. So
Yeah,
when we're
yeah,
planting the seed about anti-racism, yes, of course, it is about being nice and kind to our friends, and
yeah.
it extends to, and it doesn't matter what color your friend's skin is. We are all friends here,
Yeah.
or we are all equal, or we all have the right to play with that toy, or eat that food, or play in the playground, or hold each other's hands. It
Mm,
extends to that. It extends to look at all the difference in our classroom or all the
mm, mm,
difference in our toddler room. Isn't that beautiful? It
mm.
extends to language around what is perceived to be lovely and beautiful and good,
Yeah,
positive, you know,
yeah, yeah.
as opposed to the implicit of we don't talk about it, therefore it doesn't exist, therefore, it's not important when it
Yeah, and
actually is.
it's so important. And I think the act of noticing is really important around some of the dynamics that happen in the early years. I look at my children and I think about if we are in a communal space where there's a lots of toys, what are they choosing? And
Yeah.
especially when we look at dolls, you
Mm-hmm.
know, which one are they picking up? Which ones are they cradling? Which
Yeah.
ones are they saying are beautiful? And
Yeah.
then it is down to me and early years practitioners
Yeah.
around them to say, isn't this one beautiful? Look at her lovely hair.
Definitely.
And so it might seem like a very small thing, but re
Massive.
redressing that balance that society has kind of put in place.
Absolutely. It is massive, and modeling is so important.
Mm,
The power of observation. Dr. Stella Louis talks about this a
mm,
lot. The power of observing. It helps us to notice, it helps
mm,
us to take action where we need to take action and to model behavior, as you said, which would redress a balance.
mm,
It
mm.
may be small to you, but it's massive to know, oh, yeah, my teacher or my friend at nursery said that this doll is beautiful as well as that doll. I
Mm.
think about the early programming for
Yeah,
children.
yeah,
If they don't hear those things, if they don't see there's a similarity in the hair texture between themselves and the doll that they play with, and how important it is also for white children to
yeah,
have black dolls. Black dolls are not just for black children,
mm,
in the same way white dolls are not just for white children. If
yeah,
we think about our own early childhood and we start reflecting and noticing what happened with us, what our positive experiences were, what our negative experiences
mm,
were. I always talk about this story of remembering a white child asking me in primary school why the palm of my hands were white and why the
right.
outside of my hands were brown. And it made me think, oh gosh, yeah, why? I accepted that there was a difference. I could see
Mm,
that
mm.
the inside my hands was white, as that was the language that was used, and the outside was brown. And I just remember going home and saying, Mummy, Daddy, such and such asked me at school why did it, just actually wanting a bit of an explanation.
Yeah,
And they
yeah,
started talking to me about melanin. They
yeah,
started
yeah,
talking to me about why my skin was so enriched with melanin and what that did to the color of my skin and how beautiful it was. Bear in mind as well, I was an eczema sufferer, so I had
yeah,
really
yeah,
bad eczema. So again, there are things that happened in my early childhood that I think, God, I'm really glad that my mum and dad framed that conversation in that
yeah,
way. Because the other response might have been, well, how dare that child ask you that? You know what? I'm going to go to the school and have a conversation. That there wasn't a presumption of harm, but
yeah,
there
yeah.
was a presumption when you were in the earliest years of being inquisitive, the
Yes.
why, back to asking that question. Now, there was another incident that happened to me in my early years where I happened to be attacked by a little white boy in the school that I was in, my first year of primary. So it would have been like reception, I guess,
Yeah.
actually. And remembering that I was attacked by this little white boy, but I was blamed as the aggressor. I
Wow.
was told that I was the one that started the fight. And I remember trying to explain and articulate through tears, no, it wasn't me. I didn't hit him. I didn't do anything. He hit me and he ripped the button off my shirt. I remember feeling a sense of injustice and going home with that story and telling my
Yeah.
parents, and my parents being able to have the understanding of that being problematic,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
there's something here actually that isn't right. And this
Yeah.
actually warrants a visit to the school and a conversation with the head teacher because
Yeah. Yeah.
something's happening here that my mind wasn't able to understand through the
Mm-mm.
lens and process of race and racism. But there
It's
was
really
something,
interesting.
yeah.
Some research that I often cite when talking about certainly bias,
Mm-hmm.
conscious or unconscious.
Yeah.
A study done by I can't remember who it was now, a long time ago. Um, where a group of preschoolers were being filmed. They filmed
Yeah.
them, and they told the educators, "I just want you to press a button when you notice a problematic behaviour that has potential to become a behaviour issue.
Hmm.
Not even when they misbehave,
Yep,
potential
yep.
to misbehave."
Potential.
And there was given no information, and there was a group of children of lots of different backgrounds, and it was really interesting and possibly quite predictable
Yeah.
that the black children had the button pressed for them more often than the white children,
Hmm.
even though there was technically no issues of misbehavior, just that potential for misbehavior, and in specific, young black boys,
Hmm.
the button
Hmm.
pressed for them more often. So,
Hmm.
when we talk about
Hmm.
racism and
Hmm.
bias baked into our systems, these are
Yeah.
teachers who have
Totally.
gone into the world to make it a better place, and yet
Oh,
we are still subject to that bias.
totally.
And,
Totally.
your story reminds me of that because it was that,
Mm.
who are we looking at?
There you go. Who are we looking at? Who
Yeah,
is the aggressor? Who
yeah,
is positioned as being the bad one? Who is
yeah,
positioned as
yeah,
being the good one? And knowing, luckily for me, yes,
yeah,
my parents had that awareness of something being a little bit untoward,
yeah.
something needing to be addressed, and actually the necessity to safeguard me. I am very thankful to my parents being able to make that call and to take the action to actually say, I'm aware of what's happened and I need
Mm,
to address it with you as a school. I need to address it, with you as an educator, because I think often we are we're not immune from bias. We're not immune from racism. Even those of us who are racialized as black and brown, we hold internalized racism.
yeah,
We internalize the messages that we're given about ourselves and people who look like us. Recognizing that is essential if we're going into a space to educate people, and
yeah.
also understanding what it means to inhabit spaces where we may be the only one.
Mm,
What does
mm,
it mean to start understanding the concept of this construct called whiteness?
mm,
What
mm,
does it mean to understand that? And I think when we are starting to be familiar with perhaps terms that are new to us,
mm.
it's our duty to go and actually research what does that mean?
Yeah,
And how does that have relevance in the work that I do? Does it mean that when I speak about being an educator in an inner city school, what does inner city mean?
yeah.
And what
What's the
images are
code?
conjured? Yeah, yeah, what's the
Yeah.
code? What images are conjured when we're talking about being in a rural nursery?
Mm,
What
mm.
images around the racialized identities of those children are conjured when we are saying those
Yeah,
terms? What does it mean to dog whistle? How do we start to actually make sense of the media that we are receiving?
yeah.
How do we start understanding things around Islamophobia, things
Mm,
around anti Semitism, things around anti Blackness? What does it
mm.
mean to think about, the rise in the attacks of, I guess, East and Southeast Asian communities around COVID? Do we
Yeah, yeah,
understand that it's very nuanced, the way in which we start thinking about in our early years, what sorts of things were we taught and trained and
yeah,
exposed to? If our flattened idea of Chinese New Year is just we make things to do with dragons and
yeah.
we colour in red envelopes, that's the flattening of something that is entirely diverse and nuanced
Mm,
and
mm.
rich and beautiful, and that we move away. I've talked a lot about this, the language of Chinese New Year, and talk about Lunar New Year.
Yeah,
We move
yeah,
away from this flat pack idea of multiculturalism in the 80s being churned out to nurseries, and then we just do Diwali, and we just
yeah,
do Eid.
yeah,
We just do Chinese New Year, and then that's it. We've ticked the box.
yeah.
That isn't, that's not anti-racist practice.
No, no, and it sounds like from everything you've said, and I'm learning so much from listening to you. This is very much around educating educators first,
Yes,
around the history, the
yes,
nuances, the power
yes,
systems, how
yes,
policy works, how the media works, how beauty bias works,
yes,
how adultification works, how
yes.
all of these things work, so that when we are interacting with the youngest children in our system, we are aware of where these things might manifest.
Definitely. And we're not passing it on. We don't
Yeah.
pass on these harmful messages, these things that we have consumed as adults, as educators. How are we careful about the ways in which we have these
Mm.
conversations, or how we engage and how we interact? How do we make sure that when the black parent comes to collect their child, we're not giving them the wrong black child?
Yes.
How do we make
Yes.
sure that we're not assuming that that's such and such his dad? Because we think in our mind we've identified that child as being mixed heritage,
Yeah.
and we assume that the dad's going to be white and the mom's going to be black or whatever it is, and we've just given them the child that we think, oh, that one matches. What if there
Yeah.
is not a
Yeah.
match?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and there isn't, sometimes there
Yeah,
isn't. My children
exactly,
don't have the same
exactly.
skin tone as either of us. So, these
Sorry,
assumptions.
there's assumptions. Yeah, Benny, I was just
Yeah.
about to say, if we think about those assumptions and how we unpack that, instead of meeting that with resistance and how dare you, I'm not racist, why is it more of an issue to be accused of racism
Yeah.
than somebody who's on the receiving end of racism?
Yeah.
Instead of that, anyway, we have to say, thank you for correcting me. I
Mm.
never thought about it like that. I didn't understand. I don't understand the things that you are talking about. Could you spend some time just explaining? Because
Mm.
also in those things that we've just said, we've not even touched on colorism.
Yeah.
We've not even touched on those things that impact intra community,
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
around
Yeah.
how we start processing light skin, dark skin, what that has in terms of ramifications for children growing up,
Yeah.
who they are, and how they see themselves.
Mm.
We must celebrate all children, of course, but we must understand the nuances of what happens when children are not acknowledged, are not celebrated, are
Yeah.
not told that they're fantastic, that they have potential to do any and everything. What happens if we don't do that? Because those
Mm.
ramifications from early childhood, they last until adulthood. It means that when we go into therapy as adults, we're unpacking some of that racial trauma that perhaps we put in a
Yeah.
box for
Yeah. Yeah.
30 odd years.
Because we
So
don't recognize it,
there you
and
go.
I had a really strong memory of speaking to a friend of mine who has very, very dark skin, South Asian, but very, very dark skin, and how she really wanted to be Mary in the Nativity. And she was directly told, you don't have the right skin tone. You're too dark to be, I mean, this was in the 80s, but you're too dark to be Mary.
Can you
And
imagine? Can you imagine? But I'm telling you, Benny, that happened in 2024. I'm telling you.
yeah, and I
There are
and
things that
I'm
I have
sad to
heard,
say,
things that I've
I,
seen.
yeah, I'm sad to say I believe you.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, I recognize, there is so much work to be done, but I recognize that people do put up barriers to this work.
yeah.
Have you ever had any objections? Has
Oh,
anyone
of
ever stood up
course.
and said, Liz, you're doing the wrong thing?
Yeah, 1000%, because we live
Yeah.
in a racist society. So, of
Okay.
course, there's been objections. And I think being really honest about that is actually key to starting to challenge
Mm,
why we have to do this work. We have to challenge those people who say, why do we have to talk about this?
mm.
It's making me feel uncomfortable. My priority in this is not to center the comfort of white people. That is
Mm.
not the priority of this work. This work is to center actually the experiences of children of the global majority, to experience how it must feel to not be the one that's recognized, celebrated, acknowledged. To understand why we have to have those nuanced conversations is to
Mm.
understand that many children are marginalized for many different reasons, but we have to think about what does it mean to live in a society which is an ableist society, a patriarchal society, a racist society?
Mm.
Why is it bad to say that we live in a racist society? It is the truth. What does it
Mm.
mean to actually be in the UK right now in 2024, where we think that conversations about talking about racism makes you racist?
I mean,
So
that's the
when
thing,
I'm,
isn't it?
yeah, that's the thing, anti racism. When we think about the need to just, okay, if we don't have a conversation, it means that that doesn't happen. That's such an immature and sad way to look at how we become educators or our duty as educators. So, of course, my work has been met with resistance. Of course, my work has caused, national scandal. The highlight of my badge of honor is the Telegraph deciding to write a hit piece on me. I was just like, oh, I've made it. Of course, upsetting right wing MPs, another badge of honor. I
Yeah.
love these things for me. But it's also, sadly, it is actually the cost of this work, me putting my head above the parapet, and many, many more before me. This
Yeah.
work is not brand new. I have to stress that, Benny. This work is, as I said at the start, it's legacy work. This
Yeah.
work has
Yeah.
long been done in the early years, long been done. There are government documents that talk about the importance of working specifically with Black children and how we work positively with Black children. There are things that have been commissioned by members of parliament, which recognise the importance of anti-racist
Yeah,
work.
yeah.
And I think that's really important to actually acknowledge that this isn't brand new. This work is old. I'm not doing anything brand new. I'm not reinventing the wheel. I'm just
No.
bringing it to another audience, and I'm
And
using
yeah,
the platforms that I can and I have to get this message out here.
yeah, yeah. And that recognition that it's not new is so important. But one of the things I think happens is when it becomes visible. When it
Yes.
becomes visible, that's where
Mm-hmm.
your head is literally
Mm-hmm.
above the parapet and people's shoes.
Totally,
Um,
totally.
but it's that thing, isn't it? Of, if we talk to the young people about racism, that they might, I don't know, what have I heard? Feel like victims. That
Yeah.
they might, it's like, well, but they have to be able to recognize when they're being
Well, they have to be able to
victimized.
recognise, yeah, yeah, when they're being victimised, because otherwise you then grow up and say, I didn't experience any racism.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
didn't happen to me. And
But I
then you
think
get into
people
a
would
therapy
prefer that.
session and, yeah,
I think
of
people
course
would
they
prefer
would.
to hear that.
Until you get into a therapy session and you're asked to unpack all of the things that have happened as to
Yeah,
why something has gone on in your life and you've not directly linked it to anything that happened in your early years, anything to do with a racist incident, and then you start unraveling and unraveling and unraveling. If we are thinking about how we prioritize mental health,
yeah.
if we think about how we talk about well-being in the
Mm-mm.
education sector, if we think about why there is a need to have conversations, right now, about staff workload,
Yeah.
why are we having these conversations if we're going to then put racism and park it somewhere else? Not talk about
Mm-mm.
that because that's too difficult. We can talk about everything else. We have to be able to give and equip children with the tools to be able to say, actually, that wasn't right. And
Mm-mm.
also to encourage children who are not perhaps going to be directly impacted by racism to
Yeah.
stand by their friends and say, that's not right. Because
Yeah.
there is work for all children and all educators to do. And if we start doing this in the early years, by the time they get into reception, by the time they get into year one, they are also able, little white children, to say, that's not right.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
racist. You're not
Yeah.
supposed to say that to my friend. I'm going to
Mm.
tell the teacher because we know if we've been on the receiving end of racism, how disempowering it is
Mm-mm.
and how shocking it can be still. And as a child, you don't necessarily have those tools to unpack and to unpick it and to deal with it on in the moment. But
Mm-mm.
if you've got a group of friends who are able to advocate for you and support you emotionally, children do that.
Yeah.
Anybody that
Yeah.
works with children, you can see advocacy, you can see demand for justice,
Absolutely.
you
Yeah.
can see that's not fair, that's not
Yeah.
right, I want this. Children at 4 say that, children at 3 say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Babies express when they feel like something's gone on and they don't want it to happen. I
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
son who's 10 months old, and if he doesn't want his nappy change, he turns his body. He
Yeah.
will
Yeah.
lie on the changing mat and lull me into this false sense of, yeah, you can change my nappy, mom. You can do it. And then at the moment I take his nappy off, he'll just twist his whole body.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's him letting me know something. He can't
Yeah.
talk, but he's telling me, no, 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 no. I don't want you to change
Oh,
my nappy.
children are very vocal. And actually, in some ways, I can see the EYFS children, because they're being taught about boundaries, because they're
Yes,
being taught about right and wrong,
yes,
because they are little, are much
yes.
more well versed. And actually, there's something that tails off, I think, as they get older.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
less likely to challenge each other when they're a bit
1,000%.
older. Whereas actually, a 3-year-old will say, "No, you're not supposed to do that," and think nothing of it.
Think
And
nothing of it.
of course, if we never talk about racism in that space, they'll
There
never
you
take
go.
that with them.
There
Um,
you go.
but it needs repeating. It needs repeating throughout their trajectory. So the work you
Totally.
do has to have some follow on.
Has to be reinforced. And
Yeah,
not
yeah,
only that, children also at that very early age will also point out and say, why has that person got a walking stick? Why has that person got a
yeah,
big bum? Why has that person got brown skin? Why has that
yeah,
person's hair look like they will act, they don't have a filter.
yeah, yeah,
Children do not care. That is the beauty of early years. It's the beauty of working with children under 5 because they have no filter.
yeah,
And I think
yeah,
we have to get some of that back in terms
yeah,
of childhood and in terms of adulthood. We
yeah.
have to learn actually that there's nothing wrong with asking a question.
That
There's
exactly.
nothing wrong with creating multiple kinds of spaces. That there's no such thing as a universal safe space. What looks safe to you is not safe for me.
Yeah,
When I am doing the work that I do a lot of keynotes, I do a lot of lectures. When I'm going into a university, you might think it's safe, but have you thought about the fact that there might be a right wing mob? There might
Mm-hmm.
be the press here ready to write another hit piece. There might be people in this audience who mean me harm. Have
Mm-hmm.
you safeguarded me against that? This is a
Mm-hmm.
question as a black woman who's doing this work. I have to ask. I
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
be very mindful of that because what you think is safe is not safe
Is
for
not
me.
safe, no. And recognizing that in a room full of children, that kind of one size fits all doesn't work. This is such a kind of nuanced space.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to recognize, and a part of that racial literacy is recognizing the difference in what safety looks like for one child and what it looks like for another child.
Yes.
And I think again, potentially because of BAME, the
Yep.
label
Yep.
BAME, everybody gets
Yep.
lumped in together. Um, but the experience of South Asian children is very different from the experience of Black children,
Totally
without a
different.
doubt.
Totally different, without a doubt. And I think when we started to adopt that government language, that BAME, that
Mm,
one size fit all, that flattening, it did so much damage.
mm,
And that's why I said the importance of racial literacy is absolutely essential. We need to
mm,
know what it is like to experience the world as a South Asian child. And the South Asian child, again, unpacking that. What does it mean to be somebody who is Sikh,
mm.
and
Yeah.
follows that faith, that religion? What does it mean actually to specifically experience the world as a Muslim child and think
Hmm.
about prevent duty, particularly the harms of things like that,
Yeah, yeah.
policies like that? What does it mean to be Hindu? What does it mean to be Bengali? What does it mean to be all of these things? If we are experiencing the world as a South Asian child, we understand that's an umbrella. It is
Yeah,
still
yeah,
problematic in and of itself. We still
yeah.
need to have nuanced conversation and know who our communities are, know who our children are. If our children are newly arrived at the
Mm,
nursery, what country have they come from? What language is their first home language?
yeah, yeah.
What customs and traditions are things that we want to keep close and celebrate and acknowledge in nursery? What
Yeah,
does it
yeah.
mean for our Gypsy and Roma and traveller communities? What does it
Mm-hmm.
mean to experience things in this way? What is the home corner? What is role play? What isn't?
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
I have these nuanced conversations because I recognize that the term black, it covers so much,
yeah,
but it also covers nothing if
yeah.
we don't have the racial literacy to understand that. My experience as somebody who's born in Britain, born in Birmingham, has two parents that were born in Jamaica, my experience is very, very different to somebody whose parents were born in Nigeria. They were
Yeah,
born
yeah.
in the UK. They have a different home language, perhaps. They have a different way of doing things. The foods that they eat are different, that we are not just all in one and
Yeah,
flattened. And I think the conversation around, I've been really interested, as I said, about our East and Southeast Asian communities in the UK who have
yeah,
long been
yeah,
here, that we flatten it down to, oh, we only know those people because they're associated with the Chinese takeaway or doing nails.
yeah, yeah,
What?
yeah,
That's
yeah.
how reduced our conversations are and our lack of understanding. And we
Mm,
have to recognize that there is work to be done. The
yeah.
work of anti-racism isn't, and no pun intended, it's not black and white.
No, and when you say the work isn't done, I don't think it'll ever be done necessarily.
Mm-mm.
But I guess my last question to you, and Liz, I could talk to you all day, but I'm conscious of the time, and I'm just trying to wrap this up. But what's next for you? You've been doing this work for a little while now. But
Mm.
what plans do you have? What's your ambition?
What is my ambition? I am coming out of a period of the ring, maternity leave. I guess coming out of this period of taking time out to have my son,
Mm,
to now be the mother of a black boy.
mm.
It's really shaped and awoken something in me around what is the next step actually.
Yeah.
How do I start to prioritize me even more? How do I think about practicing the necessity of self-care?
Mm,
Because I now know that the years that I've spent mothering other people's children and nurturing other people's children, I have to make room for myself. This is a period, Benny, of lots of no's.
right. Okay.
Um, and I say that and we'll expand on that. Uh, if I be really honest, there are
Yeah.
lots of things that I am not doing. There are
Yeah.
lots of bits of work that are coming my way that I'm saying no to. That I'm saying, ask this person, ask that person, ask the other person. I am not the only one.
Yeah.
Taking up space is great, yeah, but I don't want to be a novelty. I don't want to be, well,
Yeah. Yeah.
actually, she's the only one that does anti racist work in the early years. I am not. I am not. I wouldn't be able to do this work if it wasn't for the way in which my mom did this work. If it
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
for the work of, the Laura Henry Elaine, the Dr. Stella Louis, the Dr. Yinka Olasogas. There's so
Amazing.
many
Yeah.
people that have done this work, right? And who are doing it. I wouldn't be able to do this work without the work of Jane Lane. I wouldn't be able to do this work without the work of, Bernard Cord. I wouldn't
Yeah.
be able to do it. And so I'm saying there is a long history and tradition of this. The next step for me is to say no more often. The
Yeah.
next step is also about doing work that continues to enrich and
Yeah.
to continue bringing that this work cannot be continuously rooted in trauma.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to make sure that I'm doing a lot of things around centering Black joy, centering the joy of communities and community cohesion and collaborative work, centering the work of what it means to come from a space of looking very deeply at
Yeah.
how racism has impacted future generations. What does it mean for the children that were born in 2020? What does it
Yeah.
mean
Yeah.
for the workers who were impacted by COVID, who have and had children? What does it
Hmm.
mean when we're starting to unpack that embrace report and looking at Black maternal health, looking
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
maternal health of South Asian women, looking at those statistics? What does it mean?
And actually
Yeah.
how this is like this, you said it, legacy work.
Mm,
Um, but it's still there in this present day.
yes.
And for me, the idea of centering Black joy as your next step is just phenomenal. I do
Mm,
think, you've reached that stage I'm just grateful. I'm grateful for everything that you've done.
mm.
So we are going to have to stop there, I'm afraid. I know, but thank you so much for joining me today, Liz. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure that we will have another conversation again at some point. But for now, for all of our listeners and all of our watchers, please do get in contact with Liz if you would like any further information that the work that she does. You will have access to some of her contact details. Thank you very much.